They laughed. It was the sort of laughter that lives in barracks and briefing rooms, dry, confident, a little cruel. The polished steel of the German Panzer gleamed under the parade ground lights. Men in greatcoats stood straight and self-important beside weapons that had been refined into doctrine and ritual. When the first intelligence sketches and captured reports reached them of a broad, low machine with wide tracks, a sloped front, and a crude, almost agricultural appearance, the word that slipped through lips and paperwork alike was the same: tractor-built. A joke, an insult that carried all the confidence of a military machine bred in seasons of success. For the men in the parade, and for their officers who had learned to measure strength in the smoothness of manufacture and the polish of finish, the T-34 looked unfinished, ungainly, an instrument of field repair rather than factory refinement. They imagined crews pushing, towing, cursing. They imagined broken-down relics clogging the roads. They did not imagine the sound it would make when it moved, low and patient and terrible, and the way that sound, over weeks, would begin to settle in the corners of their command posts like a new fact. The reality began not on any battlefield, but in a place of heat and rhythm where an entirely different kind of authority was forged: the Soviet tank plant. It is here, in that smoky, incandescent world where iron and human endurance meet, that the story of the machine called crude and contemptible becomes a story of stubborn invention. Mikhail Koshkin was an engineer who thought in profiles and angles. He liked the way lines met on blueprints and how a hull could be coaxed into giving protection with less weight if the designer thought differently about facing and force. He cared for drawings like others cared for children. But Koshkin's ideas did not prosper in the cool rooms of academic theories. They were baptized in the mess of practice, the fatigue of welders, the chatter of lathes, the smell of resin and coal, the rhythm of shift bells sounding night after night. On the factory floors, the machines had a heartbeat. The big presses and rolling mills thumped at a frequency that people learned to read like a pulse. When everything was right, the heart narrowed into a patient, purposeful rhythm. Sheet after sheet bent, rivet after rivet set, hull after hull coming down the line. When something went wrong, when a casting split or a suspension member cracked under bench tests, that same heartbeat jumped, and the floor answered with curses and quick hands and the cold, bitter smell of oil. A foreman named Anna Sokolova stood over a welding bench at a plant that had been hurriedly adapted to tank construction. She was not a romantic manager of industry. She was the person who could tell you how many men and women were needed to change a track in the dark, or which alloy would not splinter in the cold.
Her hands had the kind of memory that makes metal and muscle speak the same language. On slow afternoons, she could still taste the copper tang of melted welds on her teeth. They called Koshkin the dreamer, but the dreamer had a stubborn, almost surgical method. Where others saw a heavy front plate and imagined thicker armor, he drew an incline. He said quietly that armor could be longer and lighter at the same time. The cleverness is in the angle. By sloping the front plate, a round that would otherwise strike perpendicular had to strike obliquely. And an oblique strike met armor not as a flat wall, but as a surface that increased effective thickness and encouraged shells to glance off. Imagine a shield held squarely versus a shield tilted. One breaks more easily. Slopes could feed advantage into weight. That was the math of it. But good ideas are only as strong as their execution in the heat of industry. The initial prototypes failed in ways that read like a catalog of small disasters. Welds popped, castings fractured under stress tests. Suspension units broke a week into trials. The Christie suspension system, a design borrowed and adapted, promised more travel in the road wheels and better cross-country mobility. But to realize it, you needed precision in parts that the hurried, relocated factories could not always guarantee. Relocation was the first industrial miracle they performed. When front lines moved, whole plants moved farther east, away from the thunder of incoming aircraft. Massive furnaces, jigs, and inspection equipment were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and reassembled in towns that had no infrastructure for them. Workers who had built automobiles one year became tank builders the next. Women who had never held a rivet took up welding torches as if they'd been born to them. The factory became a chorus of human voices and mechanical complaint, singing the same song of necessity. They worked by schedule and desperation, and their table times were not clocks, but the distances of armies. Problems met pragmatic solutions. If a complex casting kept failing, designers stripped it back to simpler plates that were easier to stamp and weld. Interchangeability, making parts so that a hull from this plant could accept a suspension made hundreds of miles away, mattered more than elegance. Where possible, the design favored robustness over refinement. Bolts replaced complicated machined pieces. Forged stubs took the place of delicate fittings. The result was not grace, it was survivability. The diesel engine choice was another pragmatic stroke. Diesel engines are less prone to sudden fires when struck. They do not throw a column of black smoke on ignition the way some gasoline engines do. They could run on lower-grade fuel, an enormous advantage when logistics were under every stress, and their torque characteristics made them suited to pulling a heavy, slatted track through mud more patiently than high-revving gasoline units.
The diesel's thump became part of the tank's identity, a low, stubborn pulse that did not give away the crew's position with a flare and a flash. On the painted control panels and beneath the turret roofs, smaller choices compounded. Vision slits were arranged to offer reasonable fields of view, hatches sealed against dust and cold in winter. Internals were laid out to be accessible for hands dirty and numb. A simpler radio set that might be heavier but could be repaired with pliers and improvisation, won out over an elegant instrument that required a bench. Yet these practicalities were achieved amid nights of improvisation and inventive stoicism. Foremen kept lists of failed welds in notebooks, scratching notes with the same pencil until the graphite tip was nearly gone. A welder might have 3 charts, one for heat, one for metallurgy, and one for who was on shift. The reunion of errors and solutions was almost ritual. Try, fail, adapt, try again. And it produced a tank that looked rough to the outsider, but had been repeatedly, insistently improved from within. Koshkin's office was small and lined with drafts and corrections. He was not a man of grand speeches, his language was the diagram. But he also knew that a design was nothing without those who made it. He visited the line not to command but to listen. There is a kind of humility in that, a chief designer taking the hands of a worker and learning where the press produced chips, where an angle pinched, where a weld would never hold. It is an exchange of expertise where the engineer gives form and the worker gives knowledge of metal and muscle. When the first batches rolled off towards assembly yards and dispersed into columns destined for units beyond the plants, their appearance did not quiet the mockery of distant armies. The T-34's wide, aggressive tracks were built for mud as much as for momentum. A foreign officer looking at the profile might say it resembled a farm engine with armor strapped on. The nickname tractor-built stuck because appearances are the first weapons of contempt. But a machine's real test is on ground that moves and breathes and confuses. The difference between a mock and a meaningful appraisal happens when patterns of motion and failure reveal themselves. Men test machines on flat ranges. War swarms them into the disorder of roads, shell craters, frozen streams, and villages. And it was in that moving, messy world that the T-34 started to show the value of its compromises. Before the engine's diesel thud first penetrated German radio rooms as a practical problem, it was a staff room footnote. Reports of tanks that took punishment and kept going, of crews whose machines did not catch fire at the first scintilla of a hit. The stories arrived piecemeal, an officer's note about an unexplained survival, a patrol's whispered rumor, a captured vehicle with slope plates folded like a well-made coat. The accumulation of such stories began to look less like rumor and more like a pattern. Tactically, the German doctrine had relied on a certain arithmetic: identify the punch points, direct high-velocity rounds to achieve penetration, coordinate through radio nets, and keep the armor in motion. A tank that spent less time burning and more time moving was harder to kill according to the comfortable math. In the field, the sloped armor's effect was not academic. A shell aimed at a flat plate had to expend its energy to punch through directly. When a plate is sloped, 2 things happen. The projectile may strike at an angle, which increases the effective thickness, and the impact may encourage the shell to glance away rather than punch through. Imagine a stone skipping on water rather than smashing straight down. On the chaotic step, that extra degree of chance, where a violent strike turned into a scratch, meant a crew might live to drive away, repair, and return. Mobility meant more than speed. The Christie-like suspension allowed a T-34 to cross terrain where chassis with narrower tracks bogged down. The wide track distributed weight over mud and snow in a way that made short journeys possible at times when a similar Panzer might find its treads chewing earth and spinning helplessly. That mobility shifted tactical choices. You could be where the opponent expected you not to be. You could attack from unexpected angles. You could preserve forces by avoiding the obvious and by making maintenance cycles shorter. repair in the field and not on the long, slow journey to rear depots. But the machine is only one actor in a larger play. The Soviet approach to tanks emphasized numbers and logistics, to keep the machines coming, to keep them circulating from factory via rail to front, and to accept that individual tanks would be lost. The German approach prized quality and coordination. That difference in approach birthed tactical frictions that would reveal themselves dramatically in combat. A crewman named Yuri Orlov learned his trade while the plant still smelled of hot metal. He was young, hair scarred by grease, and he spoke with a casualness that suggested he'd seen more hardship in years than most men should have. In the cramped interior of a T-34, Yuri learned to feel the vehicle as if it were an animal, listening to the differential, feeling the thread of suspension through the soles of his boots, knowing when to coax throttle and when to let momentum do the work. His turret was small, his sight simple, but his training emphasized a different kind of awareness. Keep moving, seek cover in terrain, use the tank's angles to invite failure from enemy fire. On an early morning patrol, one of a dozen that moved along a secondary road, Yuri felt the tank's heartbeat like a familiar rhythm. It gave him confidence. If the worst happened, the layout and the modest mass of the vehicle meant a field repair was more likely to succeed.
He had seen his comrades strip and refit tracks by starlight, replace a wheel in an hour, and get back into business. That was a different doctrine of survival, designed for repair, accept damage, return. The German crews initially relied on their doctrine: long-range, high-velocity fire, coordinated encirclement, and the discipline of radio-directed movement. Their panzers were well made, with optics that offered superior long-range observation and guns that fire precise, penetrating rounds. But these advantages were contextual. Where visibility and firm ground were present, they counted. In deep mud, narrow roads, frozen streams, and tangled forests, those advantages shrank. Where radio coordination broke down, blocked by terrain, interrupted by confusion, or simply overwhelmed by the speed of unexpected movements, local initiative mattered more than centralized command. The first contacts resembled a conversation between two parties who had never met. One side spoke in expectations honed by practice, the other answered with behavior forged by improvisation. German commanders expected a quick accounting: find their flank, apply concentrated fire, and push through. Instead, they found tanks that refused to burn, that slid across mud with enviable surety, that used their angles to reduce the effectiveness of shots meant for flat metal. The mental shift required for the Germans, from contempt to attention, was not instantaneous. It accumulated heat and annoyance, and then became a requirement. Reports back to German headquarters started politely: this tank's armor deflects at certain angles, undefined on the precise percentage of deflections, indicating that a reevaluation of ammunition types and engagement ranges might be necessary. The word tractor fell away from memos and was replaced by the quieter, more dangerous language of problem-solving. Where once there had been a sneer, now there were calculations about velocity, impact angles, and the probability of penetration. Engineers pored over captured plates. Officers argued about how to lure such machines into kill zones where their guns could be decisive. But to execute, you needed coordination and time, two things that attrition and an active front do not always afford. Back in the plants, the pulse of industry matched the urgency on the plane. Workers knew that every delay might be translated into defeat somewhere far away. They learned to measure time not in hours but in trains and in the cadence of supply. Coal, steel, and men had to be counted with a new kind of arithmetic. What can be simplified to save a day? What can be omitted without losing the functionality that keeps a crew alive? That calculus produced the T-34's utilitarian look. It was not a machine made for parades. It was made for survival and circulation. The psychology of contempt had a cost.
When men laugh at an opponent, they may deprive themselves of effective inquiry, and so the initial underestimation of the T-34 delayed adaptations. Early panzer units expected to punch through lines with the ease they had known elsewhere, and they encountered instead a stubborn geometry of hulls and tracks that required a different response. The first German adaptation was to change ammunition types. Higher velocity rounds were possible, and to adjust firing doctrine. Another adaptation was to encourage more aggressive reconnaissance to find the T-34 in positions where its angles were less effective. But adaptation takes time, and time on the Eastern Front is a commodity measured in frost and attrition. Among the men who faced this machine, opinions changed fastest at the point of impact. A young German tanker, taken aback when his shot glanced off a sloped plate, would not call the T-34 a tractor for long. he would call it a problem. He would write in his log the contours of the hit, the angle, the unexpected sound of the shell skittering away. And in those logs, there is a small confessional quality, the admission that the enemy's crude look concealed something very practical. In the both sides' narratives, there is room for respect and for sorrow. The T-34's resilience did not erase the human cost. Each advance cost lives, each repair a set of hands, each railway a risk of attack. The plant's heartbeat and the tank's throb were linked by a thin red line of people, designers, workers, crew, who each paid, in their own way, for the gift of a machine that refused to die easily. By the time the first columns of T-34s met organized German armored response, a pattern had hardened. Those columns were not elegant. They were layered with repairs and field modifications, with muffled accents of improvisation. Yet they moved with an unassuming purpose. An infantryman at the command post who had once mocked the machine's look could not help noticing how they appeared in a field, how they crouched behind folds of terrain, how their turrets said nothing and then spoke with the measured staccato of their guns. The mockery had been a first act. The shock of their durability was an ongoing revelation. At a certain point in the cascade of encounters, an engagement occurred that would, in the minds of some German commanders, signal that this was not a trivial problem. It was not a single battle that turned doctrine overnight, and it was not a single revelation that solved everything for the Soviets. The turning point was instead a series of small shocks that accumulated into a strategic headache. Shells that missed their mark because they hit an angle and glanced. Crews who refused to bail because the fuel did not ignite. Tanks that could be pulled out and repaired in hours. A production base that replaced losses far too quickly for the Germans to accept without cost. On the morning when one such engagement began, the light was a thin, cold thing.
Radio chatter in German units had been routine at first. Reports, orders, an occasional joke. Then the tone shifted. Shorter phrases, clipped queries, a sense like the tightening of a thread. A German officer, represented in this account by a soft-voiced man who had once called the enemy's machines tractors, felt his neat categories crumble. Lines in his field notes began to read less like confident pronouncements and more like questions. What is the effective angle here? How many are in that formation? Why do their service tails keep them moving when ours burn? But at the same time, in the belly of a T-34, Yuri turned a dial, felt the diesel settle into a patient cadence, and peered through the periscope at a world of smoke and churned dirt. He knew the machine in the way a man knows a tool that has saved him from more than one scrape. He understood its limits and its gifts. He had no illusions about the cost ahead. He was not a harbinger of victory, only a man in a small iron box who had been given a device shaped by sweat and compromise. The two sides came together in a field that was both open and deceptive, where rises in the earth made ruins of maps, and where the line between hunter and hunted blurred by the hour. The first shots were not theatrical. They were ordinary. Bursts, the thump of an engine strained, a radio voice that did not return. Then, in quick succession, the battlefield changed tone. A German gun misjudged its angle. The shell glanced. A T-34 rolled with a thud and kept moving. Somewhere, a Panzer's engine choked with smoke, and the crew had to climb out to restart it. The rhythm of the front was altered not by a single drumbeat, but by an accumulation of small, stubborn pulses. It is here, at the threshold of that engagement, where the narrative holds a breath. The mockery has been replaced by a practical problem. The factory has borne fruit in a form that tests doctrine. Letters and logs on both sides will later name the moments differently, some as near misses, some as lessons learned. But in the first collision there is a raw and human clarity. Men on both sides are trying to understand the machines they command, and the machines are trying to survive in a world that does not spare nuance. If this is the kind of close, technical, dramatic unpacking you find compelling, subscribe to follow the rest of the story. There are more details ahead, of the small battles that aggregated into operational headaches, of the steps German engineers took in response, and of the human hands that kept the T-34s rolling. But now, in the dust and the static of radios, both sides reset. Orders travel back to command posts. Foremen in factories receive urgent telegrams and push for faster deliveries. Crews lick their wounds or make hasty repairs in shell-blasted ditches. The first shock has been delivered. The long, grinding conversation between design, industry, and tactic is beginning in earnest. The battlefield becomes a classroom.
Lessons will be taught in blood and metal,
Engineers will sketch corrections in the margin of reports. Commanders will alter formations and try to coax advantages from new ammunition. Plant foremen will answer with revised production runs. The T-34, once dismissed as crude and called a tractor from afar, will begin in the unforgiving arithmetic of war to force a re-examination of what an armored force must be. And yet, even as this recognition spreads, the story remains unfinished. Adaptation begets counter-adaptation, and the land is large enough that neither side's answers are instantaneous or absolute. For the moment, the smoke is still thin enough to see the silhouette of the low, sloped hull against the pale sky. The diesel heartbeat is steady. Men on both sides are at the edges of understanding, and that sliver of ignorance, what the enemy will do next, creates the most potent of human states. Focus punctured by fear and forged into resolve. The mockery has ended. The work in factories and fields is only beginning. The work in factories and fields was only beginning. What followed was a grind of attrition and adjustment, a slow arithmetic of production, tactics, and human endurance that neither side could solve with a single clever move. The T-34's arrival on the battlefield did not explode doctrine into dust overnight. It forced 1,000 smaller reckonings on firing lines, in staff rooms, and in the wagons of the rear. Each of those reckonings accumulated into operational consequences. At the operational level, the Soviets treated tanks not as individual gleaming masterpieces, but as a system. Factories, railheads, field workshops, crews trained to repair on the fly, and commanders taught to use mass as a shaping tool. The machine's ruggedness mattered because it could be sustained. Where a more refined vehicle might need a specialized lathe or an imported casting to fix a broken housing, the T-34 could be coaxed back into service with a welder's skill and a handful of scavenged bolts. That repairability was not accidental. It was embedded in the way parts were designed to be simple, interchangeable, and tolerant of rough handling. Logistics, more than any romantic battle charge, defined what armies could do with their tanks. To keep machines circulating, you had to move steel and coal and fuel. You had to run rails under air attack, and you had to staff workshops with men and women who could take night shifts and keep on working. The Soviet system, imperfect and brutal in its demands, managed to keep that conveyor moving. Plants retooled, production quotas were pushed hard, and an entire supporting network organized around replacement parts and mobile repair teams. It was not instantaneous, and it was often costly, but the result was a steady flow of ready, or repairable, machines to the front. From the German point of view, the presence of many T-34s on the sector quickly revealed a mismatch between doctrine and reality.
German armored tactics had been optimized for a different kind of opponent, well-drilled, radio-connected formations where coordinated maneuvers and concentrated fire would produce local superiority. Against the T-34's blend of survivability and mobility, that calculus had to be rethought. The response took several forms. On the technical side, armories and ordnance departments reviewed munitions and experimented with new projectiles and fuses that could better defeat sloped armor. Tactically, commanders adjusted engagement ranges and sought to funnel Soviet tanks into kill zones, places where angles could be controlled, where minefields and anti-tank guns could be deployed, or where terrain limited the T-34's traverse. Yet these responses were constrained. Ammunition development and industrial adaptation take time measured in months and in months of hard labor, not a day in the field. Moreover, many German units were themselves stretched thin, fighting on long fronts, suffering shortages of fuel and replacements. Where the Wehrmacht had previously expected to achieve penetrations through focused mechanized weight, it now found itself paying a price in time and men for every patch of ground. The T-34 did not make their guns useless. It forced them to be used differently, at higher risk and often with less decisiveness. The microphysics of fight, what happens when a shell strikes, help explain the tactical surprises. Sloped armor, as Koshkin understood it on paper and as welders realized on the line, changes the geometry of impact. A shot that meets steel at an oblique angle must either expend more energy to breach or deflect. Ballistic chains of events are notoriously probabilistic. A tiny change in angle can change a fatal penetration into a noisy dent. But beyond mere angles, there was another practical element, the way a knocked-out crew could be recovered. A tank that did not burst into flame offered a window for extraction and repair. Crews learned to fight in ways that leveraged that window, withdraw, patch, and rejoin. Over time, these behaviors produced tactical effects that accumulated into operational headache. One afternoon on a marginal road behind the lines, Yuri and his driver, Petrov, found themselves at the center of one of those small operational ripples. A sister T-34 had taken a hit to its final drive and come to a noisy halt, half in a ditch. A panzer column was probing the sector a few kilometers away, and the risk of losing the disabled machine and the men inside was real. Rather than await formal recovery, Yuri's unit improvised. Under a gray sky, they chained a tow, and by late dusk had hauled the wounded tank onto flat ground where mechanics could work. Their patchwork repair, bolts, a jury-rigged support, and a night shift of swear words was enough to get the vehicle back to a railhead.
It was the sort of small salvage that, repeated across a front, preserved fighting power in ways that supply tables rarely captured. On the German side, officers wrote in clipped reports about the problem the T-34 posed. Not a single invulnerable adversary, but a force multiplier once combined with Soviet doctrine. Some reports praised German gun design and optics. Others complained about the waste of shells fired at angles that only produced sparks and noise. The word tractor, once a sneer, vanished from those papers. It was replaced by problem, hazard, and, in more candid margins, surprise. Surprise demanded adaptation. Engineers at ordnance bureaus examined captured plates and conducted firing experiments. They tested velocities, angles, and shell types, and attempted to model the impact of slope and steel hardness. New recommendations filtered down in the form of ammunition updates and gunnery instructions. Aim higher on the hull, try to strike at less oblique angles, coordinate with infantry and artillery to fix targets. Those changes worked sometimes and not others. On muddy fields or in broken terrain, the ideal firing geometry was often unavailable, and the presence of many T-34s in a sector created operational strain. To defeat numbers, you needed ammunition, reserve forces, and time to rebuild stores, things that became scarcer with every month of war. At the same time that engineers and tacticians on both sides adapted, the factories continued to be a theater of quiet revolution. The evacuation and reassembly of plants farther east had given birth to entire communities of industrial knowledge. Lines that once produced tractors or automobiles now output armored hulls, turrets, and spare sprockets. A young foreman, another voice in that chorus, named Pavel Ivanovich, kept a ledger so worn that the paper held the grease of 1,000 hands. His notes recorded adjustments to welding angles, tweaks to suspension brackets that reduced failures, and the names of workers who had learned to perform particular fixes in the dark. Many of these fixes were small and improvisational. Together, they lifted production quality and reliability. Women played an enormous, if often under-recognized role on these lines. They ran presses, operated lathes, and learned welding by doing. Their hands became as sure as any master craftsman's, and their presence changed the rhythm of the factories. Shift work became a family of necessity, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, all contributing to a mechanical chorus. That human story, tired eyes at midnight and laughter in short breaks, the smell of oil mixing with tea, remained the beating heart behind the metal. Standardization proved to be another quiet weapon. Engineers, often under pressure, simplified components to reduce the need for specialized machining. A part that could be cold-stamped rather than cast could be produced in greater numbers with less skilled labor and in simpler workshops.
Interchangeability meant that a track link from one plant could be used on a tank from another, and that a wheel from a depot in the rear would fit the same suspension as one produced hundreds of miles away. For an advancing front that lived on the hazard of supply lines, such practical simplifications multiplied staying power. These industrial stories had their dark mirrors. The scale of mobilization required conscription, long hours, and a tolerance for risks in manufacturing that would be unacceptable in peacetime. Workers operated on fraying sleep schedules, and quality control sometimes fell prey to the demands of quota. Each salvage and repair pulled men away from homes. Each requisitioned railcar carried with it civilian goods and grief. The human cost was woven into the narrative from the start. Every extra hull rolled off the line mattered because of the people who made the sacrifice behind it. As months unfolded, the T-34's operational impact began to be visible in the campaign rhythm. Where Soviet forces could deploy multiple medium tanks that were easy to move by rail and relatively simple to repair, German formations found themselves needing to commit scarce resources to thin lines to face them. Concentrations of Soviet armor could blunt spearheads or create tactical dilemmas in multiple sectors at once.
The Wehrmacht could counter by concentrating superior firepower and coordination, but doing so meant thinning elsewhere. The strategic arithmetic of a long front, where reserves are not infinitely available and where attrition cuts both ways, favored the side that could keep replacing losses and sustain operations. Not everything about the T-34 was optimal. Early models had cramped interiors, limited optics, and ammunition stowage that could be hazardous if struck, troubles that crews learned to work around. The lack of universal radios in some formations limited centralized control. In many instances, Soviet tank units operated with a mix of radio-equipped and radio-less vehicles, relying heavily on visual signals and local initiative. That inconsistency could hamper coordinated maneuvers, and Soviet commanders sometimes paid for it with missed opportunities or costly frontal clashes. Still, in the muddy calculus of this war, those deficiencies were often outweighed by the vehicle's mobility, armor scheme, and mass-produced availability. The German response also hardened into doctrinal shifts. Where once fast, aggressive maneuver under radio control had been the favored approach, commanders began to coordinate combined arms more carefully, anti-tank guns positioned in depth, minefields arranged to channel movement, and artillery prepared to engage armor formations at range. Air assets, where available, were tasked to spot and strike columns. The result was a chess match where each side tried to anticipate the other's next adaptations. It was a costly game. Each countermeasure demanded firepower, logistics, and crucially, time.
Throughout this process, both sides recorded lessons. Military journals filled with diagrams and photographs, staff officers annotated maps, and recommended changes to deployment. The German army cataloged the T-34's advantages and recommended field expedients. The Soviet staff wrote about production bottlenecks and prioritized the most effective modifications. These institutional writings, formed in mud and shipped home in reports, would later influence armor doctrine in years to come. One of the quieter, more revealing consequences of this protracted adaptation was the way human perception changed. Where mockery had once stood, a grudging respect grew in its place. Captured tankers who had once scorned the T-34's nuttiness later spoke of its stubbornness. Commanders who had waved off reports found themselves ordering ammunition changes. Even among the factories, an awareness settled in. The machines being made were instruments in the hands of men who would pay for them with sweat and sometimes blood. There were moments of striking human contrast. In a cold dawn in a ruined village, a German sergeant, call him in the archives simply an officer of middling age, stood on a shell-cratered wall and watched a line of battered T-34s crawl forward. He observed the way crews climbed out to bang on tracks, to clear mud, to swap apart hastily. The sight was not one of admiration in any sentimental sense. It was a recognition of an opponent's will. He would later write, sober, almost clinical, that the T-34s were not the delicate contraptions he had imagined, but machines that seemed to be designed to stay in the fight. The tone of his report is representative, reluctant and precise, a soldier's respect born from encounter. As the war progressed into longer campaigns, production quantities, while important, were only part of the story. The ability to replace losses quickly and to keep crews in the fight mattered as much as the number of turrets on paper. Field repair teams, mobile workshops, and railheads that could receive, refit, and send back vehicles became as vital as artillery pieces. The T-34's design, in its toleration for rough fixes, simplified that system. You could patch the mobility issue in a field workshop and return to battle weeks sooner than you could remanufacture a precision part that more refined designs required. Beyond the immediate tactical and operational consequences, there was an architectural lesson for future tank design. The virtues of sloped armor and of a robust suspension were assimilated by engineers elsewhere. Post-war tanks would integrate lessons about angling surfaces and balancing protection with mobility, but they would also combine those ideas with better ergonomics, optics, and electronics.
The T-34's lineage is visible in a longer arc of design evolution, the acknowledgement that a good medium tank is not just about maximum armor or the biggest gun, but about a synthesis of protection, mobility, ease of production, and repair. The human cost of these technical debates, however, remains stark. Each crate of parts that arrived at a railhead represented men sent back to trenches. Each hull that survived a shelling meant moments where a crew held their breath and willed moving metal into action. Farms were trampled, villages burned, and civilians were displaced.
the tanks were not indifferent forces of nature, but human-made instruments used in human contests with human sorrow. That reality tempers any mechanical admiration. To praise ingenuity is inevitably to confront the ruin it sometimes assisted. In the factory's later years, there were quieter moments that revealed the private dimensions of the collective effort. A veteran welder named Amasha would sit with a cup of tea as a convoy passed by and watch the tank's silhouettes against the morning. She had lost friends and had welded armor that would resist shells, but her talk with younger apprentices was not of glory. It was practical counsel about heat calibration and about preserving hands and eyes from the glare. For her, the work had always been an equation of care. Do not let the work kill you before the enemy does. Mikhail Koshkin, the designer whose blueprints set the problem in motion, did not live to observe the full arc of his creation's operational history. He saw his hulls go into production and felt the momentary satisfaction of the engineer who has made a thing that functions. He did not, however, witness every victory or every technological adaptation that the war demanded. That partial absence, an inventor stepping back before his creation's legacy is complete, contains its own melancholy. Many creators step away before the world fully measures the impact of their work. Koshkin's designs continue to speak after his departure. By war's end, tanks in many places were symbols and utensils, trophies and rebel. The T-34 had become both a symbol of Soviet industrial will and a workaday instrument that, for many, represented the practical capacity to endure. In the post-war years, hulks of T-34s would be shipped to Allied nations, used in parades, or left in fields to decay. Some found their way into museums, where they sat under lights and descriptive placards. There, visitors could read clinical accounts of armor thickness and production numbers and see in patience the layers of paint and repair that time left on metal. Walking past those exhibits, one notices the human traces: a chipped turret hatch from a hurried repair, a handwritten label and faded ink describing a component swap, photographs of women on shop floors with welding masks askew as they smile for a camera. The machines are inert now. They do not throb with diesel pulses.
But the reverberations of the factory's heartbeats remain in the stories that surround them. The legacy of the T-34 is therefore double. It is technical and human at once. On one hand, it proved a set of engineering principles, slope of armor, rugged simplicity, mobility balanced with maintainability, that would inform later designs. On the other hand, it was a product of people working under pressure, of communities remade into industrial ensembles for survival, and of commanders forced, grudgingly at first, to adapt their tactics. To speak of the T-34 purely as a triumph of design is to remove the people from the story. To speak of it purely as human grit ignores the ways that engineering choices shaped outcomes. The two are braided. There is also a caution here about the limits of machines. No tank, however well designed, takes the place of comprehensive strategy. Air power, logistics, infantry, leadership, and political resolve are all actors in the same play. The T-34 changed the performance of one part of the system, but it did not, on its own, resolve the larger strategic problems of the conflict in which it fought. To grant it such credit would be to ignore the complex choreography of war. In quiet museum corners, one sometimes sees older visitors stand before a T-34 and lay a hand on its cold metal. They look as though they feel the echo of something, not the machine's pulse, which is long gone, but the memory of human rhythms that made it move. The shift bells, the smell of welder's flux, the hush of a night where men slept on pallets beside assembly lines. Those human rhythms are the thing that most deserves attention, the fact that technology is always a story of people. German tank commanders who had once laughed at the word tractor found themselves in later years telling younger officers how to think beyond appearances. They taught about angles, about surprise, and about the need to respect an opponent's capacity for adaptation. In their memoirs, the tone is seldom triumphalist. It is a soldier's appraisal of an opponent who had forced them into tactical humility. The T-34's influence extended into peacetime armored doctrine. Armies studied how to balance protection and mobility, how to consider maintainability and design, and how to build industrial systems capable of resilience under stress. The history of armored warfare, after the war, took on that cumulative knowledge. The future tank would be less of a single unmatched giant and more of a synthesis of lessons learned through blood and engineering. Finally, there is the moral frame. Machines like the T-34 can be admired for their design, studied for their tactical effects, and memorialized for the people who made and operated them.
Yet admiration must be tempered by sorrow for the lives spent shaping outcomes in which many of those same people perished. The factories that once hummed with purpose became in time silent halls or museums.
The welder's gloves were laid aside. The foreman aged. The youth who had once driven the tanks grew older. History preserved their names in small ways. A ledger here, a photograph there, a plaque that credits a plant or a design team. Those traces are partial consolation for sacrifices that, in many cases, could not be fully acknowledged. The T-34's story, marked by contempt turned to respect, by rugged practicality and industrial improvisation, by tactical surprises and doctrinal shifts, ends the way most human stories do, not with a single definitive moment, but with an accumulation of acts. A machine once mocked for its agricultural look proved to be, in many hands and across many months, a brutally effective combination of design and mass production. It did not alone win wars, but it compelled opponents to change, and it reshaped ideas about what an armored force could be. In the end, the image that stays is not of triumphal ruin, but of connection. The hum of a diesel in dawn light, welders trading tips in a noisy corner, a tank crew patching a track by lantern, an officer writing a corrective report with a hand that now respected what he had once dismissed. The mockery, so easy and human at first, gave way to a more complicated truth. Machines reveal both the craft that made them and the human choices that guide their use. If you linger before one of those silent hulks in a museum or trace a photograph of a factory floor, you will sense that mixture of ingenuity and loss. The T-34 remains a lesson in how design, industry, and human will can converge into a shape that changes a battlefield. It also stands as a reminder that the legacies of war are not only technical, they are also the faces and names behind the metal. If this episode resonated with you, consider subscribing for more deep dives into the machines and moments that shaped history. There are other stories of adaptation and invention, of countermeasures on both sides, of the engineers who answered with new designs, and of the ordinary people whose labor made strategy possible. The tale of the T-34 is, in many ways, a single thread in that broader tapestry, a story of mockery, of surprise, and of the persistent, costly human work that turns blueprints into history.